So why, in 1972, did New English Library publish a large format horror comic? Why was it so odd? Why was it so big? And why was it called Dracula if Dracula never appeared in it? Hello, Paul Pounds. So, Dracula, 1972, published by the New English Library. It's often fascinated me because it's a very strange and unique comic. Now, at the time, there was a fairly... It wasn't huge, but there was a kind of boom, popularity in black and white, magazine-size, larger format horror comics. The main publishers were Warren, who published Eerie, Creepy, and the ever popular Vampirella. And then I think their closest competitors was Skywald, who had titles like Scream, Psycho, and Nightmare. All very cool, and I will be doing future videos on some of these brilliant comics because they are my favourites to collect. So, Dracula actually began life in Spain. It's a Spanish book published by Buru Lan in 1971. Now, one of the co-founders of Buru Lan was a chap called Louis Gasca, and Buru Lan were quite successful. They'd reprinted stuff like Flash Gordon, Prince Valiant, The Phantom, kind of those pulpy adventure strips. And there was this boom in horror, and as there was the popularity with black and white horror magazines in America and the UK, the same was happening across Europe. The Spanish ones were very slightly different. They were a bit more edgier and brought kind of spicy antics into it a little bit as well. Titles like Black Dossier, Vampus, Graphical Terror, they'd all been very popular on the Spanish newsstands. And Gasco was very aware of this. He was a very astute comic book publisher, and he's written some books about comics as well, rather than just actually contributing to publishing comics. He's very knowledgeable, or was very knowledgeable, about comic book history, and if you're into comic books, there's a certain mystique about certain Spanish artists. They brought a style that we didn't really have. Traditional British comics are more of the humorous type, so you get like lovely knockabout cartoon style. American comics traditionally are kind of butch and unstoppable heroes. But Spanish comic book artists often brought a kind of expressive immediacy to their art. And the guys that made it big, the Spanish artists that made it big when I was growing up, people like Carlos Esquerra. As a kid, I didn't like it. I didn't like his style when I read 2000 AD because it wasn't like clean, neat art. There was this kind of passion underneath it all, and the artists that Gasca enlisted for Dracula were basically, they epitomised that frenetic joy of drawing. So Gasker put together a stable of comic book creators to produce this Dracula book. Now, his idea for Dracula was to take it one stage further. So the black and white horror comic magazines of the late 60s and 70s, they were almost like an art showcase. Artists like Frank Frazetta, that maybe their style didn't suit the barrel-chested American heroes of Marvel and DC comic books. They brought something different. So Gasker got a whole list of names together. Joseph Maria Beer, Enrique Sio. I'm probably ruining pronunciation here, but I don't speak Spanish. Esteban Maroto, who became a fairly big name. Alberto Solsona, who again did really well. Luis Vigil. And then the covers were going to be provided by a Spanish cover artist called Enrique. And you've probably seen some of the Dracula covers round about here, and they are beautiful. They are stunning. So Gasker's idea was to run with what was essentially a format that was more geared towards being an artist showcase, get some of the best artists and writers together. Gasker also worked as a writer on Dracula, and then produce this comic book that was even more like an art portfolio. It was printed on really high quality paper. It was a larger size than any of the other comic books that were available at the time. I mean, when it sold in this country, it was 13 pence, so 1972. So if you think, like, around that time, a British weekly comic, even the good colour ones like TV Comic and stuff, would have been about 3.5 to 4 pence. And then the Marvel and DC imports would have been round about 9 pence. So 13p is it's a bit of a step up. And when New English Library reprinted it in this country, thankfully they kept that kind of art folio feel to the whole thing. The original Dracula in Spain ran for 6 volumes, and they kept it as volumes. So issue 1 would maybe be pages 1 to 25. Issue 2 would be pages 26, and it would build up into a single volume. Each volume consisting of 12 issues, and then finishing in 1973 when they didn't carry on after that. Unfortunately, when it was published in this country, for whatever reason, I don't think it was as well embraced as it was in Spain. I guess we're more used to Whizzer and Chips, Shiver and Shake, rather than strange and psychedelic Spanish art comic portfolios. Nothing wrong with that, it's just what happens. Because we only got the first volume, issues 1 to 12. So it was translated by New English Library stalwart and one of my all-time favourite writers, Lawrence James. He got all the original issues and translated them into English. And I'm really not sure how accurate that translation was, because there's some very, very, very strange stories in this run of comics, which makes me wonder if Lawrence James did actually just simply rewrite some because it was quicker than translating them. The covers, no matter how beautiful they are, they don't necessarily enlighten you as to the contents. The contents are very, like I said about Spanish comic art being very expressive. And this was 1971, so at the end of the whole psychedelic period. And yeah, they are strange, psychedelic. I don't want to say ugly, but some of the art it's that almost like brutal, strange 70s art style, well, late 60s, early 70s art style, that now looks dated. And I think now divides opinion. A lot of people would look at these comic books and kind of go, that looks ugly. But as a kid, I think I would have probably agreed. But as I've got older, I've begun to appreciate it even more. They were reprinted in America, slightly smaller format by Warren, who collected them into a hardbound volume. And as far as I can tell, they plan to do 2 volumes, issues 1 to 6 and issues 7 to 12. I think they only got the first volume done. And I'm guessing it didn't sell well enough to do the second volume. I've been putting covers and interior panels up here, so you can kind of see that 70s brutalist aesthetic. It's not for everybody. I love 60s and 70s horror, and I honestly think that these are so stylish. And I still remember getting my first copy, not back in the day, I collected a full set back in the 90s, but I still remember getting the first couple and just being staggered by how effective the art was. As for the strips, in the British translation, we did lose a couple that weren't included in the British edition. So there were text stories which I think would have probably taken Lawrence James maybe a bit too long to translate. So they got dropped. And also a humorous strip looking at the history of vampires, and in particular Count Dracula, which was also dropped. And that was the only strip in the comic that included Dracula. So I think that's how we ended up with a comic called Dracula that didn't have Dracula in it. So it was broken down into kind of weekly episodes, a lot like a British weekly comic, like 2000 AD kind of thing. So opening just about every issue was Wolf, which was a sword and sorcery, fairly. I don't want to say run of the mill, but it's what you expect from a sword and sorcery strip, which at the time was huge. And I think it's probably my least favourite out of all the Dracula strips, simply because I'm not hugely into the whole sword and sorcery thing that was popular at the time. Then we got Sir Leo, who is one of my favourite strips. He's kind of like an Edwardian gentle chap that doesn't just go and sort occult things out. He's faced with some pretty bonkers and, again, psychedelic monsters. I know I keep using that word, but it's the best way to describe a lot of the contents of this comic book. Then there's one of the strangest strips that this comic contained, called Agar Agar, which was the fantasy adventures of a rather lusty young lady. Something like a cross between Barbarella and a Hawkwind album. And to me, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense all the time. And I can't help thinking that this was more coherent in the original Spanish version, and Lawrence James maybe rewrote large parts of this strip. I may be wrong, and it may be just that heckin' bonkers right from the start. One of the best characters in this strip was a bit of a kind of copyright infringing chap called Superbat, whose alter ego was Clark Wayne. Maybe a bit close to the whole copyright thing there. Then there was a regular strip called My Fear, which was individual horror stories, and the overarching title My Fear was dropped in the British translation, and it was just the name of the character that was in the story. These are absolutely beautiful and amazing, and a lot of them feature absolutely minimal dialogue. Some of them have no dialogue in them. And then there was just kind of individual horror stories, just something a bit more traditional. Nothing with any characters that you would kind of latch onto. So, value and availability. Price-wise, you're going to be paying round about £10 to £15 an issue. You might find them a little bit cheaper. Because of their size, and they don't fit well in comic boxes and comic bags, then a lot have kind of got a bit scuffed and battered. But because they were a bit more expensive to start with, all the ones that I've seen available, they're not in bad condition, because I think people, because they paid a bit more for them, they kept them a bit nicer. There is only 12, and that's it. That's your lot. So at least you know that you're not going to be kind of putting together a set that's going to take months and months and months and months. Like I said, I put my set together back in the early 90s. I actually stopped smoking so I could afford it. So, yeah, maybe these comics saved my life. One thing to remember if you're thinking about putting a set together, or if you're intrigued, is that the covers don't reflect the internal art. The covers are staggeringly beautiful pieces that wouldn't look out of place framed on a wall. And the internal art is very different, very now for the early 70s, very trendy for that period. So yeah, that's New English Library's Dracula. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.